To understand the British Army that eventually conquered the world, we must first understand the man who invented its professional soul. Born in Devon in 1650, amidst the debris of the English Civil War, John Churchill, later the first Duke of Marlborough, rose from the obscurity of the impoverished gentry to become the architect of a superpower. His life straddled the most volatile era of British history. From his pivotal betrayal of King James II during the Glorious Revolution of 1688 to his utter dismantling of French military supremacy at the Battle of Blenheim in 1704. By the time of his death in 1722 at Windsor Lodge, he had fundamentally altered the geopolitical map of Europe. Before Marlborough, Britain was a second-rate land power, a minor island nation shouting from the sidelines while the giants of France and Spain decided the fate of the globe. He changed the very scale of British ambition. Marlborough was not just a soldier, he was a phenomenon of personality. Unlike the grim, iron-willed commanders who would follow in the 19th century, he was a creature of courtly grace. Known as the handsome Englishman, he rose through the ranks not merely by tactical brilliance, but through an almost supernatural charm. He was a diplomat in epaulettes, capable of holding together a fracturing coalition of Dutch, Austrian and Prussian allies simply by the force of his serenity. Yet behind the velvet exterior lay a mind of cold, mathematical precision. His genius was forged in the fires of treason and ambition. He learned the art of war serving as a mercenary captain under the French Marshal Turenne, studying the very armies he would later destroy. This apprenticeship taught him a crucial lesson that would define British doctrine for the next century. Movement is life. In an age where warfare was static, obsessed with the slow, grinding sieges of fortresses, Marlborough was obsessed with aggressive speed and the decisive battle. The supreme demonstration of this philosophy came in 1704. The French king, Louis XIV, was on the verge of capturing Vienna and knocking Austria out of the war. Conventional wisdom dictated that Marlborough should stay in the Netherlands to protect the Dutch borders. Instead, he executed one of the greatest strategic gambles in history. He marched his army 250 miles deep into the heart of Germany in just 6 weeks. It was a logistical miracle. He moved thousands of men, horses, and cannons across Europe, paying for food in gold rather than looting, ensuring his men arrived fat, rested, and ready to fight. When he finally met the French at Blenheim, he shattered the myth of French invincibility. The battle was a masterclass in combined arms. Marlborough did not just throw men into the meat grinder, he played the battlefield like a chessboard. He feinted attacks on the flanks to draw the French reserves away, thinning their centre. Then, at the critical moment, he unleashed a massive cavalry charge straight through the middle. It was total destruction. For the first time in generations, a French army was not just beaten, it was erased. However, Marlborough was not a saint. He was a man of the 17th century, deeply flawed and driven by avarice. He was a double agent who betrayed one king to serve another, and even then, kept a back channel open to his enemies just in case. He amassed a vast fortune, accused of pocketing the wages of dead soldiers and taking kickbacks from bread contractors. Yet, to the men in the ranks, he was simply Corporal John, the commander who never threw their lives away without purpose. He holds a distinction that few in history can claim. He never fought a battle he did not win, and he never besieged a fortress he did not take. He left behind a British army that believed it was invincible, a psychological edge that would carry it through the next 100 years of war. But as the 18th century progressed, the gentlemanly wars of manoeuvring would give way to something far more visceral, requiring a different kind of hero. If Marlborough was the calm architect of victory, James Wolfe was its fanatical poet. Born in 1727 into a military family, Wolfe was a man who seemed destined for an early grave, if not by a bullet, then by his own failing body. He died at just 32 years old on the Plains of Abraham in 1759. a moment that would become the most celebrated death in the history of the British Empire. But before he became a painting, he was a problematic, difficult man. His short career, spanning the brutal suppression of the Jacobites at Culloden in 1746 to the conquest of Canada, represents a shift in the British officer class, the rise of the professional specialist over the aristocratic amateur. Wolfe was physically unimposing, gangly, red-haired, with a receding chin and a constitution wrecked by rheumatism and tuberculosis. He often commanded while in agony, fueled by a nervous, almost manic energy that unsettled his peers. He was moody, socially awkward, and possessed a library of military treatises that he actually read, making him an anomaly among officers who preferred drinking and gambling. He was so intense that the Duke of Newcastle complained to King George II that Wolfe was mad. The king, tired of his losing generals, famously retorted, "Mad, is he? Then I hope he will bite some of my other generals." This madness was, in reality, a singular obsession with winning. Wolfe's crucible was the Scottish Highlands, where he witnessed the terrifying effectiveness of the Highland Charge. He learned that the only counter to raw ferocity was absolute robotic discipline. He took this lesson to the New World during the 7 Years' War, determined to break the French hold on North America. The campaign for Quebec in 1759 was a nightmare of frustration. For months, the French commander Montcalm sat securely behind the city's massive walls, refusing to give battle. As the Canadian winter approached and the British fleet threatened to leave before the ice set in, Wolfe's health began to collapse. Desperate and feverish, the hero revealed a darker side. He ordered a campaign of terror, burning hundreds of French-Canadian farms and villages along the St. Lawrence River in a futile attempt to bait Montcalm out. It was a brutal, scorched-earth strategy that stained his reputation but failed to move the French. With time running out, Wolfe gambled everything on one final suicidal throw of the dice. He spotted a narrow goat-track path leading up the steep cliffs at Lens-au-Foulon. On the night of September 12th, under the cover of darkness, he led 4,500 men in small boats past the French sentries. In a moment of quiet melancholy that defines his legend, he reportedly drifted down the river reciting Gray's Elegy, murmuring that he would rather have written that poem than take Quebec. By dawn, the impossible had happened. The French woke to see a British army formed in perfect battle lines on the farmers' fields outside the city walls. Montcalm, panicked, marched out to meet them. Wolfe's tactical genius now came into play. He had ordered his men to load their muskets with 2 balls, double-shotted, to maximize the impact. He walked the lines, instructing them to hold their fire until the French were within 40 yards. When the order was finally given, the British line did not fire a ragged series of shots. They fired a single, deafening volley that sounded like a cannon crack. The double-shotted blast shattered the French army in seconds. In the smoke and confusion, Wolfe led the charge. He was shot in the wrist, then the gut, and finally the chest. As he lay dying on the field, he heard a soldier cry out, "They run! See how they run!" Wolfe asked who was running. When told it was the enemy, he whispered, "Now, God be praised, I will die in peace." He expired minutes later, securing a continent for Britain and a martyrdom for himself. He had proven that the British redcoat, properly led, could overcome any terrain and any enemy. But while Wolfe was securing the West, another man, driven by a very different kind of hunger, was carving out a private empire in the East. While Wolfe was securing North America for the crown, Robert Clive was securing India for the shareholders. Clive is perhaps the most controversial figure in British military history because he was not, strictly speaking, a soldier of the king. He was a mercenary employee of the East India Company, a man who proved that in the chaotic political landscape of the 18th century subcontinent, war could be the most profitable business of all. His life was a testament to the volatile power of unchecked ambition and the privatization of imperial violence. Born in 1725, Clive was a problem child, a Shropshire gang leader who ran protection rackets in his hometown before his exasperated family shipped him off to Madras to work as a junior clerk or writer for the company. He hated it. Sweltering in the heat, tallying bales of cloth, he grew deeply depressed, twice attempting suicide with a pistol that failed to fire. It was only when the French attacked British interests in India that Clive found his escape. He volunteered for the company militia and discovered a terrifying truth. Under fire, his melancholy vanished, replaced by a cold, manic clarity. He was likely bipolar, oscillating between crippling depression and a reckless, almost suicidal energy on the battlefield. Clive's military genius was not tactical in the traditional sense. It was psychological and transactional. He understood that the massive armies of the local Nawabs were often loose coalitions held together by cash and fear. If he could break their nerve, or buy their leaders, he could win against impossible odds. He demonstrated this first at the Siege of Arcot in 1751, where, with a tiny force, he marched through a violent thunderstorm to capture the enemy capital, terrifying the garrison into believing his men were demons impervious to the elements. But his defining moment, the moment that shifted the center of gravity in the world economy, was the Battle of Plassey in 1757. On paper, it was a suicide mission. Clive's 3,000 company troops faced 50,000 Bengali soldiers and French artillery. In reality, Plassey was less a battle than a hostile corporate takeover. Before a shot was fired, Clive had secretly negotiated with Mir Jafar, the Nawab's commander-in-chief, promising him the throne in exchange for betraying his master. The battle took place during the monsoon season. When a torrential downpour soaked the battlefield, the Bengali artillery neglected to cover their gunpowder, rendering their cannons useless. Clive, the meticulous professional, ensured his men kept their powder dry under tarpaulins. When the Bengali cavalry charged, assuming the British guns were also silenced, they were met with devastating grapeshot. Amidst the confusion, Mir Jafar's vast division simply stood still, refusing to fight. The Nawab, realizing the betrayal, fled on a fast camel. Clive had conquered a kingdom the size of France with the loss of only 22 British soldiers. The aftermath was nothing short of looting on an industrial scale. Clive walked into the treasury of Murshidabad and personally pocketed a fortune that would make him the richest self-made man in Europe. When later questioned by Parliament about this staggering corruption, he famously replied that, given the piles of gold and jewels he saw, he stood astonished at his own moderation. Clive transformed the East India Company from a trading group into a sovereign power, laying the groundwork for the British Raj. But the guilt of his acquisitions, compounded by his chronic illness and addiction to opium, eventually caught up with him. The man who could buy armies and topple kings could not conquer his own demons, eventually dying by his own hand in London. Yet the empire he bought remained. As the company consolidated its hold on India, the British Army itself was undergoing a painful evolution, moving away from the rigid lines of Marlborough and Wolfe toward a more flexible, intelligent style of fighting, pioneered by a man who would become the spiritual father of the modern infantryman. If Robert Clive represented the chaotic, avaricious energy of the empire's expansion, Sir John Moore represented its conscience and its intellect. Born in Glasgow in 1761, Moore was a soldier who looked at the British Army and saw a machine that was broken. He had served as a junior officer during the disaster of the American War of Independence, where he watched helpless redcoats, drilled to march in straight lines, get picked apart by American rebels, hiding in trees and behind rocks. He realized that the era of the mindless automaton, the soldier flogged into obedience and treated like a beast, was over. To defeat the armies of revolutionary France, Britain needed a new kind of warrior, the thinking soldier. Moore's great contribution was not a conquest, but a classroom. At Shorncliffe Camp in 1803, he established a training ground that would revolutionize warfare. He created the light infantry, elite units like the 95th Rifles, who wore green jackets instead of red to blend into the terrain. He abandoned the clumsy musket for the Baker rifle, a weapon slow to load but deadly accurate at 300 yards. More importantly, he revolutionized the relationship between officer and man. Moore insisted that officers know the names of their privates and treat them with humanity. He reduced flogging and encouraged initiative. He believed that if you treated a man with respect, he would fight with intelligence. This theory was put to the ultimate test in 1808 during the Peninsular War. Moore was given command of the British forces in Spain, only to find himself walking into a trap. Napoleon Bonaparte had invaded the country with 200,000 veterans, intent on driving the British into the sea. Moore had only 23,000 men. A lesser general would have retreated immediately. Moore, however, chose a strategic gamble that bordered on suicide. He lunged toward Napoleon's supply lines, threatening the French communications. It worked. Napoleon, furious at the audacity of this small British force, diverted his entire army to crush Moore. This bought the Spanish insurgents crucial time to regroup, but it left Moore in a desperate situation. He now had to outrun an emperor. The retreat to Corunna became one of the most harrowing episodes in British military history. For weeks, the army marched through the freezing mountains of Galicia. Discipline collapsed. Soldiers, starving and frozen, looted Spanish villages and drank themselves into stupors, dying by the hundreds along the roadside. Moore, the humanitarian, was forced to become the disciplinarian, pushing his men to the breaking point to keep them ahead of the French vanguard. By the time they reached the port of Corunna in January 1809, the army was a wreck, their uniforms in tatters, their boots worn through to the skin. But they were still an army. With the Royal Navy ships visible in the bay, the French Marshal Soult attacked, hoping to annihilate the British on the beach. Moore turned to fight. Utilizing the very light infantry tactics he had perfected, his men held the village of Elvina against repeated French assaults. The thinking soldiers of Shorncliffe did not break. They repelled the French, securing the evacuation of the army. In the moment of victory, disaster struck. Moore was hit by a cannonball that shattered his left shoulder and exposed his ribs. He remained conscious, refusing to let his aides unbuckle his sword, insisting he leave the field with it on. He died knowing the army was safe. In a scene immortalized in poetry, his staff buried him hastily at night on the ramparts of Corunna, wrapped only in his military cloak, before fleeing to the ships. Moore saved the army, but more importantly, he left behind a weapon, the Light Division, that would eventually return to Spain. But it would be led by a man who lacked Moore's warmth, but possessed a strategic mind of terrifying coldness. If Robert Clive represented the chaotic, avaricious energy of the Empire's expansion, Sir John Moore represented its conscience and its intellect. Born in Glasgow in 1761, Moore was a soldier who looked at the British Army and saw a machine that was broken. He had served as a junior officer during the disaster of the American War of Independence, where he watched helpless redcoats, drilled to march in straight lines, get picked apart by American rebels hiding in trees and behind rocks. He realized that the era of the mindless automaton, the soldier flogged into obedience and treated like a beast, was over. To defeat the armies of revolutionary France, Britain needed a new kind of warrior, the thinking soldier. Moore's great contribution was not a conquest, but a classroom. At Shorncliffe Camp in 1803, he established a training ground that would revolutionize warfare. He created the light infantry, elite units like the 95th Rifles, who wore green jackets instead of red to blend into the terrain. He abandoned the clumsy musket for the Baker rifle, a weapon slow to load but deadly accurate at 300 yards. More importantly, he revolutionized the relationship between officer and man. Moore insisted that officers know the names of their privates and treat them with humanity. He reduced flogging and encouraged initiative. He believed that if you treated a man with respect, he would fight with intelligence. This theory was put to the ultimate test in 1808 during the Peninsular War. Moore was given command of the British forces in Spain, only to find himself walking into a trap. Napoleon Bonaparte had invaded the country with 200,000 veterans, intent on driving the British into the sea. Moore had only 23,000 men. A lesser general would have retreated immediately. Moore, however, chose a strategic gamble that bordered on suicide. He lunged towards Napoleon's supply lines, threatening the French communications. It worked. Napoleon, furious at the audacity of this small British force, diverted his entire army to crush Moore. This bought the Spanish insurgents crucial time to regroup, but it left Moore in a desperate situation. He now had to outrun an emperor. The retreat to Corunna became one of the most harrowing episodes in British military history. For weeks, the army marched through the freezing mountains of Galicia. Discipline collapsed. Soldiers, starving and frozen, looted Spanish villages and drank themselves into stupors, dying by the hundreds along the roadside. Moore, the humanitarian, was forced to become the disciplinarian, pushing his men to the breaking point to keep them ahead of the French vanguard. By the time they reached the port of Corunna in January 1809, the army was a wreck, their uniforms in tatters, their boots worn through to the skin. But they were still an army. With the Royal Navy ships visible in the bay, the French Marshal Soult attacked, hoping to annihilate the British on the beach. Moore turned to fight. Utilizing the very light infantry tactics he had perfected, his men held the village of Elvina against repeated French assaults. The thinking soldiers of Shorncliffe did not break. They repelled the French, securing the evacuation of the army. In the moment of victory, disaster struck. Moore was hit by a cannonball that shattered his left shoulder and exposed his ribs. He remained conscious, refusing to let his aides unbuckle his sword, insisting he leave the field with it on. He died, knowing the army was safe. In a scene immortalized in poetry, his staff buried him hastily at night on the ramparts of Corunna, wrapped only in his military cloak before fleeing to the ships. Moore saved the army, but more importantly, he left behind a weapon, the Light Division, that would eventually return to Spain. But it would be led by a man who lacked Moore's warmth, but possessed a strategic mind of terrifying coldness. If Wellington was the mind of the army, Henry Paget, the Earl of Uxbridge, later the Marquess of Anglesey, was its adrenaline. He was the quintessential Regency buck, immensely wealthy, dangerously arrogant, and widely considered the finest horseman in England. He spent fortunes on his uniforms, favouring the flamboyant hussar style, and rode with a reckless abandon that terrified his friends and enemies alike. But his relationship with Wellington was poisonous. Years before Waterloo, Paget had eloped with the wife of Wellington's younger brother, causing a society scandal that made him a pariah. Wellington loathed him, only accepting him as his cavalry commander because the Prince Regent insisted. It was a command relationship built on icy silence, yet it produced one of the most spectacular moments in military history. Paget personified the British cavalry problem. The British horsemen were undisputed masters of the charge, big men on big horses, capable of smashing through any formation in Europe, but they lacked discipline. Wellington famously complained that his cavalry officers had a trick of galloping at everything, never considering the situation or keeping a reserve. They were a one-shot weapon, a magnificent projectile that, once fired, could not be recalled. Paget did not disagree. In fact, he revelled in it. He believed in shock action, the idea that a massed charge, timed perfectly, could psychologically shatter an enemy army before physical contact was even made. The ultimate test of this philosophy came in the crisis of Waterloo. In the early afternoon, a massive French infantry corps of 14,000 men, commanded by Count d'Erlon, was crushing the British left wing. The redcoat line was buckling. Wellington, seeing the disaster unfolding, nodded to Paget. This was the moment for the projectile. Paget ordered his two heavy brigades, the Household Brigade and the Union Brigade, famous for the Scots Greys, to charge. What followed was perhaps the most violent few minutes of the 19th century. Paget led from the front, indistinguishable from a junior officer in his eagerness. The 2,000 heavy cavalrymen smashed into the French infantry with the force of a tidal wave. The psychological shock was absolute. French columns dissolved into panic as the giant British horses trampled them into the mud. In minutes, they took 3,000 prisoners and captured 2 French eagles. It was a tactical masterpiece that saved the battle. But then, the British disease took over. Instead of rallying his men and returning to the British lines, Paget lost control. The adrenaline-fueled troopers, seeing the French running, went tally-ho mad. They ignored the trumpet calls to retreat and galloped wildly across the valley, straight into the teeth of the French guns. Their horses blew out, exhausted by the mud and the speed. Seeing them stranded, Napoleon's lancers counterattacked. The hunters became the prey. The magnificent Union Brigade was cut to pieces, effectively destroying the British heavy cavalry as a fighting force for the rest of the day. Paget survived the slaughter, spending the rest of the battle riding frantically between shattered squadrons, trying to plug gaps in the line. In the dying moments of the battle, as the victory was finally secured, he was riding alongside Wellington when a stray, terrifying sound of grape shot tore through the air. Paget looked down to see his right leg shattered. In a display of stoicism that borders on caricature, he turned to the Duke and remarked, "By God, sir, I've lost my leg." Wellington, momentarily lowering his telescope, replied dryly, "By God, sir, so you have." Paget's leg was amputated without anaesthetic, a procedure he endured with a smile, famously quipping that he had had a long run with it. The leg was buried with full military honours in a garden near the battlefield, becoming a macabre tourist attraction for years. Paget survived to wear the world's first articulated wooden limb, but his charge at Waterloo remained his legacy, a moment of brilliant, flawed glory that perfectly encapsulated the aristocratic recklessness of the era. But while the cavalry sought glory in the open fields, the dirty, brutal work of the war was often left to the infantry divisions, specifically those led by men who had no time for gentlemanly conduct. If Wellington was the brain and Paget the flash, Sir Thomas Picton was the fist. Born in Wales in 1758, Picton was a giant of a man, standing over 6 feet tall with a voice that could be heard over the roar of cannon fire. He was not a polished aristocrat. He was a rough-hewn brawler who despised the pomp and ceremony of military life. He famously refused to wear a proper general's uniform, often fighting in a shabby civilian topcoat and a round hat, a top hat, looking more like an enraged banker than a divisional commander. Wellington, who valued competence over manners, tolerated him because Picton was the only man who could command the Fighting Third Division, the hardest, toughest unit in the Peninsular Army. Picton's reputation was forged in the white man's grave of the West Indies, where he served as governor of Trinidad. It was there that his dark side emerged. He ruled the island with an iron hand, becoming embroiled in a scandal involving the torture of a young girl, Louisa Calderon, to extract a confession. The incident led to a sensational trial in England, where he was branded the tyrant of Trinidad. Though he eventually escaped a legal punishment, he was a pariah in polite society. But in the desperate years of the Napoleonic Wars, the British Army could not afford to be picky. They needed a killer, and Picton was exactly that. His military philosophy was simple: direct violence. He had little patience for complex maneuvers or flanking attacks. His method was the frontal assault. He would line up his division, scream obscenities to get their blood up, calling them villains and rascals as terms of endearment, and then hurl them straight at the enemy. He led from the front, often beating stragglers with his umbrella or cane, treating the battlefield like a chaotic street fight. This brutality was necessary during the siege of Badajoz in 1812. The main British assault on the breaches had failed, resulting in thousands of casualties in the ditch. The attack was stalling, and defeat seemed imminent. Picton, wounded in the groin and barely able to stand, refused to retreat. He ordered his division to attack the castle walls, a secondary objective with sheer, unclimbable ramparts. Against all odds, and under a rain of French grenades and boulders, his men clawed their way up the ladders. Picton's sheer force of will drove them over the top, capturing the castle and forcing the French surrender. It was a victory won not by tactics, but by stubborn refusal to die. His final act at Waterloo was characteristic of the man. 2 days prior, at the Battle of Quatre Bras, he had been severely wounded by a cannonball that broke his ribs. Knowing he would be sent to the rear if he reported it, he told no one, wrapping his bruised black and blue torso in dirty bandages and riding out to meet Napoleon. During the crisis of the battle, as Derland's column threatened to break the line, Picton deployed his depleted division. Facing odds of 4-1, he ordered a close-range volley and roared, "Charge! Charge! Hurrah!" At the very moment of impact, as his men crashed into the French, a musket ball struck him in the temple. He died instantly, falling from his horse into the mud, leading the counterattack that saved the day. When his body was later examined, doctors were horrified to find the extent of his previous injuries. He had fought the battle of the century while half crippled by pain, fueled purely by adrenaline and rage. He was the hammer of the army, a blunt instrument used to smash through obstacles that no one else could break. But while Picton relied on brute force, another commander in the army was proving that discipline and science could be even deadlier weapons. If Picton was the blunt hammer, Robert Craufurd was the scalpel, sharp, precise, and dangerous to handle. Known to history as Black Bob, a nickname that referred as much to his dark, depressive moods as to his swarthy complexion, Craufurd was a man consumed by a terrifying perfectionism. He commanded the Light Division during its golden age, inheriting the legacy of Sir John Moore, Section 4, and refining it into a weapon of unmatched lethality. But unlike Moore, who was loved, Craufurd was feared. He was a martinet who believed that in the chaos of war, only robotic adherence to procedure stood between life and death. Craufurd's philosophy was born from humiliation. Early in his career, he had been forced to surrender his unit during the disastrous British invasion of Buenos Aires in 1807, not due to his own failure, but because of the incompetence of his superior. This trauma left him with a permanent chip on his shoulder. He returned to Europe bitter, rebellious, and determined never to rely on a fool again. He trusted only himself and the system he created. His standing orders became the Bible of the Light Division. He treated marching and camp discipline like a science. He calculated the exact weight a soldier could carry and the precise speed at which a column could move without exhausting the men. He introduced the Craufurd Step, a system where soldiers could march at ease, smoking and talking, but snap into battle formation instantly. His obsession with logistics was so extreme that he would halt the entire army to berate a soldier for not drinking water correctly. While other generals flogged men for crimes, Craufurd flogged them for inefficiencies. Yet, his men grudgingly worshipped him because they knew his harshness had a purpose. Under Black Bob, you didn't starve, and you didn't get surprised. His military genius lay in the scientific skirmish. He viewed the rearguard action, the most difficult maneuver in warfare, as a mathematical problem. This was proven in 1810 at the combat of the Coa. Defying Wellington's direct orders to retreat across the river, Craufurd chose to stay and fight with 4,000 men against 20,000 French troops under Marshal Ney. It was an act of breathtaking insubordination. When the French swarmed him, Craufurd realized his mistake. He had to retreat his entire division across a single narrow bridge while under heavy fire. A lesser commander would have panicked. Craufurd, however, directed the retreat with the precision of a drill sergeant. He used the 95th Rifles to hold the bridge, piling up French bodies so high they physically blocked the path of the enemy. He extracted his division from the jaws of destruction, saving them to fight another day. Wellington was furious, telling him, "I cannot accuse you of being late, but I can accuse you of being too early." But he did not fire him. Craufurd was simply too good. His end came, fittingly, while trying to impose order on chaos. At the storming of Ciudad Rodrigo in 1812, Craufurd led the attack personally. Standing on the open glacis, the exposed slope leading to the walls, He was shouting instructions to his men when a musket ball passed through his lung. He lingered for days in agony, apologizing to his officers for his temper during the campaign. When he died, the men who had feared his lash wept openly. They buried him in the very breach of the wall he had captured, cementing him literally and metaphorically into the foundations of the victory. He had turned the British soldier into a professional athlete of war, but the era of the scientific soldier was about to give way to the era of the eccentric imperial adventurer. As the Napoleonic Wars faded into memory, the British Empire entered a new phase, the Victorian era of colonial expansion. This was not a time for the rigid formations of Europe, but for the wild, improvisational warfare of the frontier. No man embodied this shift more than Sir Charles Napier. Born in 1782, Napier was a relic of the old wars who refused to die. He had been practically dismembered at the Battle of Corunna in 1809, shot in the leg, stabbed in the back, and struck on the head with a sabre. Yet he survived, albeit with a permanent limp, a crooked neck, and a constant twitch. By the 1840s, he looked less like a general and more like an Old Testament prophet, sporting a magnificent, waist-length beard and large steel-rimmed spectacles strapped to his head. Napier was a contradiction, a radical liberal who hated the aristocracy and the greed of the East India Company. Yet he became one of the empire's most aggressive conquerors. He was the ultimate man on the spot, a general far from London who decided foreign policy himself. In 1843, he was sent to the province of Shinde in modern Pakistan, merely to keep the peace. Instead, he decided to conquer it. He openly admitted in his diary that he had no right to seize the territory, calling it a humane piece of rascality, but he did it anyway, driven by a desire for glory and the massive prize money that came with conquest. His military philosophy was simple. Aggression is the best defense. He believed that when facing irregular armies, you must never show weakness. This was tested at the Battle of Miani in 1843. Napier found himself facing 30,000 Baluchi warriors with only 2,800 troops. A conventional general would have retreated. Napier ordered a frontal charge. The battle was a medieval scrum. The Baluchi army was entrenched in a dry riverbed, waiting to swamp the British line. Napier, realizing his men were hesitating, rode his horse alone into the gap between the armies, waving his hat and swearing at his troops to advance. For 3 hours, the British line stood at the edge of the riverbank, fighting hand-to-hand with swords and bayonets against waves of attackers. Napier, peering through his thick glasses, rode unharmed through the slaughter, seemingly protected by his own audacity. His artillery eventually broke the enemy mass, and a cavalry charge sealed the victory. Napier's conquest of Scinde was controversial. He had effectively provoked a war to win a province. Punch magazine famously satirized him with the apocryphal one-word telegram to London, Peccavi, Latin for I have sinned, a pun on I have Cinder. But the public loved him. He was the rogue hero, the man who hanged priests for burning widows and treated his private soldiers like sons, mentioning them by name in his reports. A revolutionary act in a class-obsessed army. He proved that a small, disciplined force, led by a commander with absolute moral certainty, however misplaced, could dominate vast populations. But as the century wore on, the empire would face a threat that not even Napier's aggression could quell easily, requiring a return to the steady, unglamorous professionalism of the past. If Napier was the eccentric outlier, Colin Campbell was the backbone. His career is the perfect bookend to the Redcoat era. Born in 1792, the son of a Glasgow carpenter, he lied about his age to enlist and fought his first battles under Sir John Moore in the retreat to Corunna. He was still fighting 50 years later during the Indian Mutiny. In a system dominated by aristocrats who bought their commissions, Campbell was a rarity, a man who rose purely on merit, taking 44 years to reach the rank of general. He was the old warhorse, a soldier who carried the institutional memory of the Napoleonic Wars into the industrial age. Campbell's caution was born of trauma. As a young lieutenant in 1813, he led the Forlorn Hope, the suicide squad tasked with storming the breach at the siege of San Sebastian. He was shot through the hip and the thigh, left to bleed for hours among piles of British corpses. He survived, but the memory of that slaughter never left him. Unlike the glory-hunting cavalry officers he despised, Campbell viewed his soldiers not as expendable pawns, but as a finite resource to be hoarded and protected. He became the father figure of the army, a gruff, curly-haired Scot who personally checked his men's rations and tents, earning the nickname Old Kubadar, Old Commander from the troops in India. His defining moment came in 1854 during the Crimean War at the Battle of Balaclava. The Russian cavalry was sweeping down on the British supply base, and the only force standing in their way was Campbell and his 93rd Highlanders. Conventional tactics dictated that infantry must form a square to repel cavalry. Campbell, trusting in the discipline of his veterans and the power of the new Minié rifle, did not bother. He deployed his men in a line only 2 men deep. It was a gamble that relied entirely on nerve. As the Russian cavalry thundered towards them, the Highlanders, eager to fight, began to step forward. Campbell, riding along the front, barked, "93rd! Damn all that eagerness!" He forced them to stand rock still. They delivered steady, rolling volleys that shattered the Russian charge without yielding an inch. A war correspondent watching from the heights described them as a thin red streak tipped with a line of steel, a phrase that would pass into legend as the Thin Red Line. Campbell's final campaign was the suppression of the Indian Mutiny in 1857. At the relief of Lucknow, he faced a city turned into a fortress by mutinous sepoys. A younger, more reckless general might have ordered a bayonet charge into the narrow streets, ensuring a massacre. Campbell, remembering the horror of San Sebastian, refused. He brought up heavy naval guns and systematically demolished the rebel strongholds building by building, treating the city like a siege. He was criticized by the press and politicians for moving too slow, but he famously retorted, "I am not going to throw away the lives of British soldiers to please the newspapers." When Colin Campbell died in 1863, the era of the Redcoat died with him. He had marched with Moore, fought for Wellington, and held the line for Queen Victoria. He represented the triumph of the professional over the amateur, the steady file over the wild charge. From the aristocratic genius of Marlborough to the grim survivalism of Campbell, these 10 generals forged a military tradition that transformed a small island nation into the master of the globe. They were geniuses and gamblers, martyrs and monsters, but together they built the machine that was the British Army. Thank you for listening to our story. If you found this history as fascinating as we did, please like this video and subscribe to British War History for more. We read all of your comments, so be sure to leave your thoughts below. We'll see you in the next video.